your mind.
Good evening, and welcome to Cult Free Radio. Sorry about the little delay there between the music and my jumping in. I've got multiple things going on, as I usually do on Cult Free Radio. As you know, if you've listened before, a show never goes perfectly smoothly, but that's life, isn't it? Especially when you're talking about cults and cult recovery and being cult free. So welcome to this, the 15th Cult Free Radio show, and the second of the Cult Free Radio reboot. As I had mentioned last month in the August show, I had been off or on hiatus for over 3 years, and in 2011 and the first part of 2012, I did the Cult Free Radio show, about 13, yes, because that would be August and September, 14 and 15. So this is the 15th Cult Free Radio show, and something that's a little bit different about the format of the show is that rather than have it be topical, so to speak, like, for instance, the topic of education and Jehovah's Witnesses, or the topic of the summer district conventions, or the topic of flip-flops in the organization, or their Kingdom Hall building money grab, or whatever. Instead of being topical, it's going to be, like it was last month, more interview-based. And although I did interviews in the past, they were based on a particular topic for that particular show. The topic now is pretty much the ex-Jehovah's Witness experience and all that that implies. So it could be somewhat thematic, like last month it was about Joe Morgan, our guest, and his personal experience, as well as a bit about the Australian Royal Commission, cover-up of child abuse, and more so than that, the point, one of the many points that was made during the commission, that the organization is a captive organization because people are scared or guilt-tripped into not leaving because you're going to be shunned otherwise. And so that's sort of a running theme that all Jehovah's Witnesses, former Jehovah's Witnesses, inactive Jehovah's Witnesses, faded, disfellowshipped, disassociated, all have to face and deal with that specter of shunning. And so that's going to come up a lot, basically because the interviews each show are going to be primarily with people who are ex-Jehovah's Witnesses in one way or the other. Now, last month, our guest, Joe Morgan, he is formally has been disfellowshipped from his congregation. Tonight's guest, who I will reveal soon, I know in all of the posts I've made online kind of advertising the show, I have not said who it's going to be. But I will reveal that, I promise. And she happens to be, like myself, faded, inactive, not disassociated or disfellowshipped. And so there's a somewhat different perspective on the shunning that happens and the shunning that possibly does not yet happen due to that inactive status. So we're going to talk about some of those things tonight and on subsequent shows. Not to say that I will never do a show on a particular theme. It's just that at this point, I think that a lot can be accomplished just talking to one another, interviewing and talking with ex-Jehovah's Witnesses and hearing the ways in which our stories are unique and the ways in which our stories are similar and how we're not alone, and yet every story is different enough to be interesting, at least to me. I enjoy interviewing people much more than I do hearing myself talk, which I think it's a good thing to be open enough to listen to other people, and so that's what I want to do. So without a whole lot of further ado, I don't want to keep going on and on, but I do want to make one more comment. Some of the early ads I made for this episode or this show, I mentioned the horrible audio in my interview recording. Well, we did a do-over. We finally found some time where we could do the interview again, and the audio is much, much better. So I'm not going to, as previously planned, go on and on apologizing for poor audio quality, because it's my hope that we will have decent audio throughout the show tonight. Not too many glitches, and the audio will sound good for everybody. So now, that's enough intro stuff. We have an interview with somebody that probably a good number of the listeners know by her Facebook name. And she is Patricia Russell. And she is going to tell us about her experience, her story. And so let's get right to it. Here is Patricia Russell, and then afterwards I'll make a few comments, and that will be Cult Free Radio Show 15 for September 2015. So here's Patricia. Well, thank you for joining us this evening, Patricia. I'm glad we have a chance to talk a little bit about your experience as a Jehovah's Witness and an ex-Jehovah's Witness. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thanks. Now, I'm going to start the way I start with most people, is at the beginning. How long were you one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and were you raised in the religion?
So I was a witness for the first, I would say technically the first 26 or 27 years of my life. I was born to witness parents, and I was baptized when I was 13. And then I pioneered from age 17 to age 25. And then at about age 27, I started fading out of the religion.
Okay. And so, like most kids raised as a witness, you were baptized as a teenager?
I was, yeah.
Okay. So, also like most Jehovah's Witnesses, you get to that age of 17, 18, 19, and the only way to date is to court and want to get married. Did you happen to marry a Jehovah's Witness, or were you married?
No, I missed that boat. Yeah, and it wasn't for lack of wanting to kind of enter that arena. It was just it was one of those things where I don't know if this is true in all areas, but certainly where I was, the amount of, quote unquote acceptable witness females was far greater than the amount of good exemplary witness males. And, adding to that, I loved the prestige, honestly loved the prestige of being just a a single pioneer, and kind of I felt like the more I held out and didn't get married, the higher my stock value went.
That's
So I
probably true,
kind
yeah.
of, yeah, I would kind of ice out perfectly nice guys because they just weren't quite dynamic enough. And then
Hmm.
I had my ideal people, a couple people who I just kind of thought, wow, if they ever decide to get married, I really would love to be in the running for that. Um, which would have actually been a disaster once I started fading.
Right.
So I suppose it's lucky that I was so picky.
So at that point, when you say ideal, you mean from a Jehovah's Witness perspective, right? I mean,
Definitely.
what was their level, and what was yours? You were talking about prestige. I mean, women can only reach a certain level in the congregation, but did you serve in any particular roles?
Definitely. I would say I was about as high um, level as a single pioneer sister could be. So I was serving where the need was great for a while, and then I helped out a foreign language congregation, a Spanish congregation, for the last few years that I was active, and I was a pioneer. And I was one of those people who just seemed to be able to juggle everything and spin all the plates and keep everything going. And so I even had the opportunity to assist a couple people on the Pioneers Assist Others program and take them out in service. So, and I got asked to do a lot of impromptu talks, number 3 talks at the Theocratic Ministry School. So, that's pretty high class
Hmm.
stuff for a
Yeah.
girl.
Yeah, because there is no, there's a really low ceiling for women in this
Yeah,
organization. You can't become a ministerial servant or an elder or anything like that. So
exactly.
those sorts of things are what they call privileges, are about the most that you can get. So
Mhm.
you're doing all these things. You're an ambitious witness. So does that mean you were a true believer at the time? Did you have any doubts going on?
If when I did have doubts or kind of nagging feelings, they weren't something that I really acknowledged until after I had started fading. So I would consider a very true believer. Um, so, way back when I was a teenager, um, I wouldn't say that it was my, you know, excuse me, my overwhelming zeal for Jehovah that made me want to get baptized. I think the baptism decision was more of I want to be accepted by the
Hmm.
congregation. And there were a lot of kind of family issues that went into why the acceptance from the congregation would be so important to me. But, in my late teen years, I had done the classic make the truth your own thing, where I really started to take things seriously, go out and service a lot more. And in doing that, I became determined to be the best pioneer and the best witness I could be. And it was because I really felt it was the truth. And I felt like, this was what Jehovah wanted me to do. And I had given up so much in giving up, college scholarship opportunities and different just life opportunities that would have been available to me otherwise. So I felt like, you know, this if this isn't what it is, then I've wasted all this time. So
Yeah.
this better be right.
Yeah, I think that something that we've talked about a lot on some of the earlier cult-free radio shows is the education issue and how the organization frowns on secular education, worldly education, going to college. And it kind of turns out to, in a way, it protects the organization from people discovering things that would help them leave, but it also hurts the organization financially because there aren't a lot of high level career people in the organization. Um,
Absolutely.
so you're pioneering, you're in your late teens, early 20s, still pioneering, and you used the word fade. And I think most of the audience understands what a fade is, but um, can you sort of explain a little bit about your status as a witness. If you're a fader, you're not disfellowshipped or disassociated. And why would that be?
Um, well, the purpose of the fade, I think, for a lot of people who decide to do it while they are fully awake is, I know this is not the truth, but I don't want to lose contact with my family, and I want to spare myself the ordeal of being called before a judicial committee and either disfellowshipped or being given the opportunity to disassociate with a letter, and I want to spare the shunning. Um, Fading basically means you're no longer at meetings, you just kind of ghosted out of the organization. And so no one really knows what's going on, and you need to kind of keep it that way, because if they poke a little too hard, they might find out enough information to make a judicial committee necessary.
Right, right. Yeah, and I'm a fader as well, so I mean that question was really more for the audience. It reminds me of last month in the month of August during the Royal Commission hearings, where I forget which person from the branch it was being interviewed, but it was during the time when Mr. Stewart, the solicitor, was trying to make the point that it's a captive organization and there's no real way to leave with any kind of dignity because of the shunning issue. And it was almost like the guy from the branch was encouraging fading or becoming inactive, because his
Mm-hmm.
answer was like, well, you can just stop going to meetings and we won't bother you too much.
Yeah,
you
I
know,
believe it was O'Brien.
it
He
might have been
was the,
O'Brien, yeah.
yeah, it was the last person interviewed, and it was on the last half of the seventh day. So it was almost, I would say, within the last hour or two of recording, if I'm not mistaken.
I think you're right now that you mention it. But
Yeah.
it's not exactly true what he
No,
said,
no,
because, you and I both know what life is like as a fader. In a
exactly.
way, you're kind of living in fear, aren't you?
Absolutely. You are constantly living in fear, and it's not something that makes things easier. You just pick a different kind of torture, really. And I felt it was very disingenuous of O'Brien and later Jeffrey Jackson in claiming that, oh, this is just a different option. You know, we're not a police state. We don't pursue people. We don't go to people's houses and spy on them, because that's exactly what they do.
Yeah.
And to different degrees with different people. Some people are able to successfully fade a little more quietly, but there's always that fear in the back of their minds that what if someone from the congregation comes and sees my house and sees the Christmas decorations, or sees the obvious evidence that I'm living with someone who I'm not married to, or, you know, sees the atheist book on my counter, or whatever. And so you never really get to fully breathe and feel free. And in fact, I think it was Bo Jewell recently who posted something in response to a post someone had made about fading versus disassociating. Um, and he basically said, you're never truly free if you fade until you actually make a clean break. And I know that some faders have had the rare luxury of being able to be completely free, but I think that what he said is likely more true for the vast majority of people who fade, where they're doing it because it is the lesser of two evils for their personal situation, but they're doing it full well knowing that they will never truly be free while they have to stay in that status.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, and I've told my story on the air already, so I won't rehash it in too great a detail. But I'm basically fated so that my mom and dad aren't put into a situation where they have to make a decision on whether to shun me or not. Because I'm just inactive, they can associate with me without any repercussions to them. They've both told me that they would still associate with me if I happen to be disfellowshipped or disassociated, but then they would get a hassle from their own congregation, and I don't want to put that on them, because they're meeting me halfway, I'm meeting them partway. So that's the long story short from my perspective. Now, when we were off the air and actually on Facebook, I believe you had mentioned an experience you had where you happened to see uh, witnesses that you used to know out in public. And it was sort of a triggering event for you and exemplifies what you're talking about here with fading. Could you share that
Mhm.
experience with us?
Sure. And I think this is the one that I'm thinking of that you were thinking of too, because there's been a few, but this was just very recently. And to give some background, I moved about a year and a half to another city, about 5 hours from where I was an active witness, but it's a big city. And so it is a destination for a lot of people vacation wise. And because of that, I have kind of maybe unconsciously or without acknowledging it, I've avoided a lot of public places where there could be clusters of people who know me, even here, 5 hours away from where I was ever a witness. But a couple weeks ago, I actually took the rare step of going downtown, and I went to a political rally, and then I was walking, and I was with the guy, and I was walking through a kind of busy public open air market. So just to set up how I looked, I wasn't dressed in anything terribly quote unquote worldly looking, but I had some blue streaks in my hair, and I was wearing a Bernie Sanders political pin from the rally that I had gone to, and I was with the male without having a chaperone. So,
And he's not an
you know,
elder or anything, right?
no, no, no. Beard on the face and everything. So, it was quite clear that, gee, I sure don't look like a witness anymore. So I passed someone, and this was in the first really non-political public area. So it was the first place where I really started to feel like, oh no, I could be running into some witnesses here. But then in the back of my mind, I was thinking, oh no, obviously that's silly. I'm 5 hours away. What, am I just going to be scared my whole life? I need to get over this and get out in public. And one of the first people I saw, I was like, I recognize her. Oh my gosh, I recognize her. So I said something, and then we just continued going. We were like, well, oh well, we're here. We're just gonna blend into the crowd. And then I saw her again with her husband, who's an elder who was in my grandpa's congregation and definitely knows me, definitely knows my family. And I've actually performed in a band with him at one point. So, there's no doubt as to knowing who this person is and knowing who his wife is and his kids are, and standing with blue in my hair with a political pin with a guy, in
Yeah.
this city, this big city. Who could have thought, or who could have imagined that would be the first few people who I run into? But I realized, here I've been making all this distance between myself and the former congregation I was a member of, and trying to really establish myself in a new area. And I'm still so scared of being discovered and having that information taken back to my family and back to the congregation where my cards are, that I shut down for the rest of that day. And I just rehashed and rehashed and rehashed. What could they have seen? Maybe they didn't see the blue in my hair. Maybe they didn't see that I was walking with a guy. Maybe they didn't even see my face. They weren't looking at me when they walked by. But it was enough to send me into a tailspin.
Wow.
And I would say that perfectly encapsulates the utter anxiety of being a fader and just always living in fear that anyone you run into could know who you are and take that information to people who wish to harm you.
Right. And this is after how many years?
So I first stopped going to meetings back in 2011.
Okay.
And then I lived in the city where I was a witness for about 2 years after that, 2.5 years. And then, so it was a total of 4 years from when I had stopped going to meetings.
Yeah. So it doesn't just go away on its own quickly. It takes some time, and it takes more than just, I think, as you say, geographic distance. It takes temporal distance, and as long as you have a connection, a family connection that sort of holds you in. Like, I still want to have a relationship with my mom and dad. That, you're tied. Your hands are
Yes.
tied. So I'm looking over my notes here, and I've got too many. So you also, Patricia, is not your real name, just like I am not really Mad Sweeney. And that's, I think, a common thing for faders to do online. And could you kind of maybe talk about the possible reasons for that and how you came up with your name?
Sure. So, yeah, Patricia is definitely not my real name. And what happened was a couple well, I would say actually just about a year ago, I had the opportunity to be interviewed by a local radio show. It was actually an atheist radio program, but I was being interviewed specifically about being a witness and having grown up in that religion. So I realized that um, it could be listened to by active witnesses, and they would definitely know my real name because it's not as common as Patricia. And so at the last minute, I asked the host if I could change to a different name, and it's a 3-syllable name, so Patricia was an acceptable stand-in for that. And I did that interview, um, and kind of started the persona of Patricia, which it's still me. It's not like I'm making up things or inventing a new personality. It's just a
Right,
different
right.
name. But that kind of sat from last October. That was when I did the radio show, until this past January. And then I had discovered in January the JW podcast show, and I wanted to do a call-in voicemail message about my father's experience. He died last year after refusing blood. And so I wanted to talk about the hospital liaison committee a little bit. And I chose the name Patricia as my kind of pseudonym for that voicemail so that I also didn't give away who I really was. And then I started a Facebook page, a Facebook identity with Patricia. And I full well know that there's always the opportunity that Facebook could realize that that's not actually my name and demand some sort of identification from me. I really hope that that doesn't happen, but that's what Patricia came from, and I actually find it easiest if I don't tell the majority of people what my real name is, just
Hmm.
because the less people know, the less they'll be likely to publicly call me that other
Right.
name and give me away. At some point, though, it might be possible, or it might be time to merge and to reveal what my real name is, especially if I get to found out anyway, and it doesn't any longer have any value in keeping the pseudonym. But yeah, for now, that is where I am safe. And Russell is because Charles Taze Russell.
Right, the founder of the Watchtower Society and what became Jehovah's Witnesses. So
Exactly.
you're not actually descended from Brother Pastor Russell, are you?
I hope not.
Yeah. So I find that Russell is used by a few people on Facebook because of that very reason, which is quite interesting to me. And yeah, so I mean, being a fader, part of that is a significant portion of your life is spent in hiding, or
Yes.
hiding a significant portion of your life from the witness authorities who are looking for something to catch you on. So we've talked about what it's like to fade, the sort of the stresses that faders and inactive witnesses are under. But one thing we haven't talked about yet is why fade? Why did you fade in the first place? And how did that come about for you?
Okay, yeah. And it
Was there a specific doctrine that threw you, or
no,
did it
no,
gradually happen? Because sometimes it happens gradually to people. I mean,
it
everybody's
it
got their own
actually
story, so.
it was not something that I did consciously at the beginning.
Okay.
And I know a couple of other people who have said the same thing. I didn't wake up while I was still a witness and just with a jolt, while I was still all active at meetings and everything, realized that, oh my goodness, this is all a lie, and there's nothing about this that is even close to the truth.
So you're not a calculated fader.
No, no,
Okay.
no, no, no. What actually happened was a lot more mundane than that, and that is that about a year after I stopped pioneering, due to the stress of working a full-time 40-hour-a-week job and pioneering in a foreign language, I um, I started leading a double life, and I just, it got to be too much. I started to get really stressed. I was at that point in my mid to late 20s, and I had started kind of just getting antsy and being stressed and being kind of tapped out energy wise. And so, all of those things conspired to just make me make what I felt were very bad decisions at the time. And because of that, because I was still a full believer and I was doing that, I full well thought, I can't go to meeting. The elders will just be able to tell that something bad is happening and that I'm doing something bad, because they just have special like voodoo eye powers where they can actually sense
Oh yeah, Holy Spirit.
your bad. Yeah, you really feel that way. You feel like,
Yep.
you've heard people from the platform say that when there is unrepentant and unpunished sin happening in a congregation, that Jehovah removes his Holy Spirit from the whole congregation. So in a weird way, it's almost like by removing myself and by just fading out and stopping going to meetings, I was not only protecting myself from having just the traumatic experience of the elders discovering me and taking me before a judicial committee, but I also was protecting the whole congregation from having to have Holy Spirit removed from them by just removing myself instead. So and it wasn't quite all thought out like that. I just basically would get anxiety whenever I thought about going to meeting.
Mm-hmm.
So at some points I even went to meeting. I got there, I sat through the first 3/4 of the meeting, and then I would just, thinking about talking with everybody after meeting, my blood pressure would raise, and I actually left the meeting in tears a couple of times, and just I found myself just not being able to get dressed for meeting and go before meeting. So I would stay at home, and I actually, it became so bad that I was getting prescription like anti-anxiety medication for it, and it was affecting my work and everything. So it just became easier at a point to stop going to meeting and stop dealing with that. And then I had already stopped pioneering, so I was already not on their kind of radar quite as much. I was still on the radar, of course, because they all worried about me, but I was not quite as heavily scrutinized as I would have been as a pioneer. So aside from some very concerned emails, and a couple of people even messaged me on Skype and tried to text me and see, just, did I want to hang out? Did I want to do something encouraging? Did I want to go study for the Watchtower? That kind of thing. It was several months of love bombing, followed by just people stopped contacting me. And then I would get a text from our, at the time, presiding overseer, now it's called the coordinator of the congregation, or coordinator of the body of elders. Anyway, he would text to let me know when the memorial was, and he would text to let me know when any special talks were. And oddly enough, I'd get a text before the Kingdom Hall cleaning for our book study group, or our service group, because they had just dismantled the book studies not very long before that.
Right.
So anyway, I got every so often a bit of contact, but I was still a full believer. And every time I got contacted by someone, I felt guilty, and I felt like, this is just beating myself over the head even more. I remember laying in bed on Saturday morning when I should have been out in service, and just crying and thinking, I need to tell them. I'm going to tell them today. I'm going to call the elders. I'm going to tell them today. I just need to get this off my chest, because Jehovah knows that I've done this bad thing, and I need to just heal myself spiritually. And I've got this big spiritual injury that needs recovering through whatever they decide to do to me. So that was the status until I would say early to mid 2012.
So you took at least a year of this stress, this guilt and fear before you started waking up?
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
So in 2012, I had a coworker start to kind of ask me some gentle probing questions about if I was still a witness. And oh, by the way, I worked at a location with several witnesses working there. So people knew at the time that I started working that I was a witness and I was pioneering. And then they just saw me kind of start to behave less and less like a witness. And so I'm sure that was why he was asking is, hey, are you still one or not?
Mm-hmm.
But he started asking me very critical questions, but in a very kind of non-confrontational manner. So my hackles didn't go up quite as much when he was asking me these questions. And I remember one of them was about um, it was a very like biblically detailed question about doctrine and if I believed a certain doctrine was right or not. I don't remember what it was.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to kind of explain it using my old JW hat, and I was failing horribly at it. But I found myself like, hey, this is a witnessing opportunity. Jehovah can still use me as a someone who preaches, even though I'm doing all these bad things. And then he asked me about the blood issue, and I found myself trying to defend it. And it was so weird because, here I hadn't been doing anything with the truth or with what I thought was the truth for over a year. And I was kind of vehemently defending this blood policy. And then he said something that kind of stopped me from defending it. And he said, I have a son, and I would never let my son die. If it doesn't matter what the Bible says, I would protect my son and I would give him a blood transfusion. I would make sure that he gets any medical care necessary to survive. I don't care what the Bible says, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And as he said that, I realized, like, what am I doing? Of course you would protect your son. Of course you would give him blood if he needed blood. This is stupid. Why am I defending this flawed, weird policy when I haven't even been going to meetings? So I stopped defending the blood policy in that conversation. And then that coworker said, well, I'm an atheist, and I actually think that, there's a lot of problems with the Bible. And let me show you this video that shows some of those problems with the Bible. So he pulled up a video of the Atheist Experience, which I since have become a big fan of that show. But it was specifically a video about all of the different gods who were worshipped by Israel in the Old Testament. And of course, that any witness will tell you, oh no, Jehovah was the only God. Yahweh was the only God who was worshipped by Israel. But this show was basically going through all of the other gods who
Mm-hmm.
were being worshipped, and there was proof, and there was anthropological or archaeological, I should say,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
data about that, and also scriptural data about that. And as they were reading the scriptures, I found myself going, wait a second, this is the same Bible I've devoted my life to preaching, and I've defended, and I don't even know it. And so that shook me to my core, and I kind of started going down the rabbit hole of, do I believe in a creator or not? It was still several months. I don't even remember how long, but it was still quite a while before I started to poke holes in the doctrine of Jehovah's Witnesses. So I actually stopped believing in God before I realized what a cult I was a part of. I had fond feelings and kind of I had a good feeling about the truth, what I called the truth, for a long time after I realized there didn't seem to be a logical reason for believing in God to me. And then, even then, I was still scared of looking on the internet about witnesses. So I would say it was like early 2013 before I really started to check out anything apostate on the internet.
Mm. But then once that ball is rolling, it's like a snowball, actually, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's no stopping. There were a couple things you mentioned that I wanted to ask you for a little follow up on.
Sure.
Now, you mentioned quote unquote doing bad things and feeling guilty about it. Now, by bad things, I assume you mean bad from Jehovah's Witnesses' viewpoint.
Oh yeah.
Things like having a blue streak in your hair or going on a date with a guy. Is that the type of bad stuff you're talking about? I mean,
Yeah.
you weren't a
Yeah.
bad person.
No, no, no. I'm saying doing bad things from the standpoint of an active, exemplary witness.
Right. And
And
I think
so,
that does show a bit how extreme a religion this is.
absolutely, yeah. I will too say though that when I had started fading by accident, part of what kind of complicated things for me was that um, because I had lived my life in this witness bubble, I had zero skills for how to handle life and relationships and worldly people and myself. And so I actually fell into all these very common kind of dating and relationship traps. And I behaved kind of like a crazy kid in a candy store a little bit for quite a
Mm-hmm.
while. And because I was hiding what I was doing from witnesses, I became really good at kind of telling half truths or fully untrue things. So I actually struggled for quite a while with honesty and where I could be honest and where it's in my own best interest with witnesses to not be honest. But it took a while for me to realize that I it's still in my best interest to be completely honest with people as long as um, as long as I'm protecting myself from needless cult judicial action
Right.
and and kind of discovering my own sense of morality outside of Jehovah's Witnesses, basically.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to follow up with as well. That this coworker of yours,
Hmm.
who is an atheist, and some of the other things that you've read online or in books or elsewhere, non-witness literature, have you have begun to develop a different standard for morality other than the Watchtower. Um, how is that? How does that progress, and how is that going for you?
Um, I feel like for the first time I'm doing the right things, but for the right reasons, in the sense that
Not just because you're told to and afraid to be
exactly,
punished. Yeah.
exactly. And what's crazy about the JW morality standards is that for every single quote unquote moral thing they do or don't do, the reason why they're doing it or not doing it is because someone has written an edict from above that says they can or can't.
Hmm.
And because of that, occasionally they do things which, from a human standpoint, are very immoral, like telling people that they can't have life-saving medical treatment because of an antiquated Bronze Age law
Right.
about not eating a certain type of food. And so, for me, it was actually a discovery of I need to find out what I do or don't want to do because doing it or not doing it is in my best interest and in the interest of hurting the least amount of people. Um, and I need to do that because it is what I sense to be right or wrong, regardless of what someone is telling me to do.
Right.
And that you have to have this, you have to learn that you do have an inner voice that is shaped by your experiences and by your observations of what people do and don't benefit from. And, saying, well, the reason why I don't do something is because someone tells me not to.
Hmm.
That's just self-protection. That's not really morality.
Right.
That's just
And it really
self-protection.
is selfishly motivated, because
Absolutely.
the reason that you obey as a Jehovah's Witness is so you can get into the new system. I mean, if
Absolutely.
there wasn't that reward of the new system, none of us would have done half the stuff that they told us to do,
Yeah,
because, it's the carrot and the stick.
exactly.
So
And
without those, you wouldn't obey.
Yeah, and for me, there was a period of time where I basically had stripped away all of the witness morality reasons from my brain, but I was like a brand new baby in a weird way.
Hmm.
And so I did a lot of things that in hindsight and in retrospect I absolutely am sick about. And I lied to people who had no reason to be lied to, and I did things that I deeply, deeply regret. And, I'm not saying that because I'm trying to beat myself up. I'm just acknowledging that it was because I had this whole time been doing things just because I was being told to. And so once the reason for me doing those things and not doing those things was taken away, there was nothing there. And I had to rebuild from scratch. And it's almost until now I've still been rebuilding those things from scratch and reestablishing trust with people who I'm close to, and reestablishing trust with myself that I'm not a bad person. I was just raised in a cult, and I had a very warped upbringing
Yeah.
in that way. And you know, I think that's a big thing that a lot of ex-witnesses struggle with, is just endless guilt and beating themselves up for behaving exactly as they were programmed to behave as witnesses. You're just acting almost on instinct, on a on a track that it's really hard to get off of. And
Right.
a lot of people go into these kind of really bad patterns and bad behaviors, not because they're bad people, but because they have had zero real life training
Yeah.
and they've had zero opportunities to really test themselves outside of the cult.
Right. Being raised in, especially, you're not equipped in any way whatsoever to live in the real world. So once you get out into the real world, no matter whether you're a fader or a disfellowshipped or what, once you're out there, you really are starting brand new from
Yeah.
scratch. And, I consider people like you who managed to get out in their 20s more fortunate. Uh, I was in my 40s and I'm still kind of figuring out everything still. It's only been
Yeah.
about 5 or 6 years for me now.
Yeah.
One, two, three, four. Yeah, 5 or 6. So, I mean, it's a learning experience, but it's an opportunity to grow. And, we do make mistakes. And that's another thing. In the organization, when you make a mistake, you're trained to really beat yourself up over it and feel very guilty about it. But in the real world, everybody makes mistakes. And I think most people acknowledge that we all make mistakes and they're an opportunity for growth, especially if you own them and just try to do better next time, and people can see that.
Yeah. And with being a witness, you don't ever get that opportunity, because immediately you're told, God already knows, Jehovah already knows that you made that mistake, and now you're going to have to fess up.
Right.
And if you don't do it, then you are deliberately sinning against Jehovah, and he's sad.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's horrible. It's a horrible thing to have over your head when you're 6 years old and you do something silly like eat birthday candy. And it's a horrible thing when you're in your late 20s and you've started, quote unquote, messing around with guys, and then feeling like, you're going to be destroyed in Armageddon. I
Yeah.
think a lot of why witnesses who leave, or who wake up, or who haven't woken up yet, but who are somehow removed from being at meetings all the time, I think the reason why they beat themselves up so much is because, or why they do those crazy things in the first place, is because, well, you might as well live it up because you're going to die at
Yeah.
Armageddon. And you never were going to die before. You
Right.
never had a finite point where your life was going to end.
Mm-hmm.
So now that all of a sudden your life has been cut short by eons and millennia, well, what's the
Yeah.
point of even doing anything except just living it up and, being as crazy as possible and doing as many drugs as possible and sleeping around as much as possible.
Right.
And
Because you're, like you said, the circumstances, the results, the consequences. There's the word. The consequences are already determined
yeah,
because you're out. You're not a witness. You're dead. You're like the Walking Dead already. So you
you
may as
are.
well do whatever you want to do because what more can Jehovah do to you? So they say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's tragic if you think about it. And I think for me, part of what broke that script um, was realizing that just because my life is short now, I mean, relatively short, I still got quite a bit of it left, but my life will end at some point. Um, it was always going to end. I just didn't acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm.
I have the chance to really make something of it outside of furthering a publishing company. And so, you know, every moment has the potential to be treasured, and it's okay to live for the moment. And you're taught not to as a witness. You're taught, if you're indulging too much, it's bad. You should always have this end goal of furthering the publishing company. So kind of being able to slow down a little bit and say, I can accomplish things and I can also enjoy things, and it's okay. And I can invent for myself what my purpose is. I'm not being prescribed one.
Right.
That's really big.
Yeah. And knowing that, like you said, you can appreciate the present as opposed to keeping your eyes on the prize constantly and deferring anything good for yourself. Because if, as a witness, thinking about now and thinking about wanting to have a good life is considered selfish, self-centered. We need to be self-sacrificing, give everything to Jehovah, and then get our reward later. Well, once you realize that later reward is not real, it gives you an appreciation for day to day, like you said. Now,
Exactly.
I'm going to go back a little bit in our conversation because there's one more note that I thought of that I maybe you've considered but didn't mention, or maybe you haven't thought of, about your coworker. When he approached you and asked you if you were still a witness, um, you mentioned also that you worked with other witnesses at that place. Do you think maybe he saw them acting differently towards you? Because as a fader or as an inactive person and as a former strong witness, I think we both know that witnesses have this sort of unwritten hierarchy or structure where they sort of are judgmental or will shun you even if you're not disfellowship just because you're considered weak or whatever. Do you think that they may have let on around the workplace that you were of a different status than you used to be?
I actually doubt it in this particular case, but I acknowledge that your point is the way it is for a lot of people who work with witnesses. In my case, it was part of what I did when I faded was I told everybody in my foreign language congregation that I was going back to the English, and then everybody in the English congregations just knew that I was still in the Spanish, and so I kind of was able to fade into this. Kind of this gap between those two entities where I didn't have to justify where I was on
Gotcha.
Sundays and on meeting nights. And some of the people who I was working with were from the foreign language congregation that I had left, and some of them were from the English congregations. And I was in a very heavy witness area, so there were a dozen or more congregations. So it was very easy to say, oh no, I was just at that other meeting.
Yeah.
And also I had
It also sounds kind of
as
precarious, though, too.
it was a little precarious. I had also told the elders when I was first starting to miss meetings that I was just having a lot of anxiety and I was having a hard time getting to the meetings. And so I had gotten a code for the conference call method of listening in on the meetings. So I was taken care of from their eyes in the sense that, oh, well, if she's not at meetings, she's obviously just listening in. So, so we're good with her. So, so I don't think that the people who I worked with, that I was even on their radar necessarily.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, it's a relief. It was definitely, it would have been a lot worse if I was working for witnesses.
Oh, yeah.
But I was working for a government agency. So, I didn't see them very often.
Okay. Well, speaking of work, we mentioned a little bit about education and not being able to pursue much of a post-secondary education as a witness or pursue a lucrative career. Have you been able to at least consider or make plans for furthering your education since you've been out of the witnesses, or training for a specific career that actually interests you as opposed to, working for whichever brother is hiring at the moment?
I have actually, and for right now, I went back to school in 2013, and I actually got my license in massage therapy,
Awesome.
and so I've been doing that, and that has been, that's not where I want to end up for my whole life, but it is a means to have income, and so I still do have the goal of going back to school and actually, or going to school, I should say, and actually getting a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in something related to psychology, cult recovery, um, dealing with people who have come out of abusive cults and relationships. And I actually have a goal in my area of eventually opening up a physical location where people can come who are either in the process of leaving a religion, leaving a cult, or leaving an abusive family situation or relationship, and they can get group therapy and maybe even individual therapy on a sliding scale.
Mm-hmm.
I want to coordinate with yoga teachers and other therapy providers like art and music therapy. And I just kind of want to get a healing place established. And this is an area where there's a lot of witnesses within a 2-hour radius of where I live. And so, and there's a lot of other religions. In fact, there's an evangelical cult religion here locally that has just gone through a massive kind of reinvention, and the original leader of that group was ousted, and a lot of people had been shunned. They actually practice shunning, so there's a lot of people who are kind of in shambles after that, and so I see the need beyond even Jehovah's Witnesses for cult recovery. That's like a 5-year or 10-year plan, depending on
It
what
sounds
I'm able
very
to do.
ambitious. Really cool, though.
It's everybody I've talked to, especially non-witnesses who I've talked to, are just like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think that would be a need, but I can totally see where it would be. There's a local Scientology church here that people, I'm sure, are being shunned from or being disconnected from. There's a big Mormon presence here. There's other, religions that I can't even think of at the moment, but that are definitely on the cult spectrum. So so that I haven't even actually started classes again, but I have the goal of kind of getting established in some way educationally to where I have a basis for that, and then also connecting with people who have much more training in those areas, so that it's not just my show, but that it's kind of just the starting point from which a lot of good things can happen with other people.
Cool. Well, it sounds like you're certainly going to pay it forward and help a lot of people. That's awesome. Well, Patricia, I appreciate you talking with me today, and it sounds like you are well on your way to an amazing and awesome life, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share a little bit of my story.
Great. Thank you. Well, that was Patricia. So thank you very much, Patricia, for joining us on Cult Free Radio this evening. That was an awesome discussion that really reveals a lot to the listeners about what it is like to be not disfellowshipped or disassociated, but just inactive, or as we in the ex-Jehovah's Witness community tend to call it, faded or a fader. So thank you. Appreciate that very much. I love the idea of the sort of, I know you didn't use this term, but the term that popped into my head was like the halfway house, or a recovery program that's, I don't want to say inpatient, because I don't think it's that sort of recovery, residential sort of recovery house. We'll come up with a name. We'll talk about it. Whatever you call it, I think it's an awesome idea. And I think that there is a great need, especially it seems like for people who their family is nearly or maybe actually 100% Jehovah's Witnesses, and they really have nowhere else to go on the outside, and they have no idea of where they're going on the outside, how they're going to approach life, because it is, as you and I both know, and many of the listeners know, it's like getting a brand new start. It's like being a child again in so many ways, socially. The interactions that we have in the real world as opposed to in the congregation are hardly comparable. It's completely different, and it's something the organization doesn't prepare us for. So it's really quite important to have that sort of support. And there's a lot of online support, but I'm not sure there is a lot of actual hands-on face-to-face support unless you happen to know somebody or stumble across somebody as you're leaving the organization who can help you in that way. So I love the idea of a residential program, and in fact it probably should be a regional thing at some point that the Northwest, the Northeast, the South, the central United States, the Southwest. I mean, every area could have some sort of house where people leaving some sort of religious abuse, some sort of cult, can get the help they need, the transition, and to get some counseling, some recovery support, and that sort of thing. That's a great idea. Something else that you had mentioned while you were giving your experience about fading and when you first started was the love bombing. And that just leads me to want to talk for a minute or two about loaded language. That term has come up on the show before as we talk about cults and the way that cults manipulate and control people. And love bombing is just one of those. Actually, love bombing isn't a loaded language term, but it's a technique that cults use that's much like loaded language. And it's a specific sort of language that we use in the ex-Jehovah's Witness community. But love bombing is a technique of just showing all kinds of positive attention to somebody who's new or somebody you're trying to influence. And so that tends to happen to new Bible studies the first time they're at the Kingdom Hall and the first several times, and as well to people who they're trying to, weak people who they're trying to get back, so to speak, and get back into the fold. So that's kind of what love bombing is, and it just reminded me of the topic of loaded language, which I like to touch upon now and then, because loaded language is when cults have their own words for things. And for instance, they talk a lot about things like unity or encouragement and other things that mean worldly. We used that several times tonight. It doesn't mean to people in a cult what it means in the dictionary and what it means to normal people. So anyway, I'll probably talk about that some more as it comes up in other future interviews. And but like I said, the theme of the show is not going to be necessarily topical, but I would like to emphasize loaded language and other cult control techniques such as love bombing as well as often as I possibly can. So we can have some good, interesting, fun stories to listen to from one another, as well as a little bit of education for people who may not have heard some of the earlier shows when I went through a lot of the new psychological stuff I was reading about as I was a newly faded or inactive witness at the time. So again, thank you, Patricia, for your interview. I'd like to apologize for the glitches. Towards the beginning there were a couple, and in the middle there was a glitch. I will fix all that before I post this to YouTube, and you'll get to hear the whole show and the whole interview without any interruptions. But thank you all for listening to Cult Free Radio. There will be, if everything goes according to plan, another Cult Free Radio show on the second Saturday of October. And I believe I have an interview lined up with a delightful woman. And I'm not going to tell you who that is until the night of the show, just like I did tonight. So, looking forward to Cult Free Radio again next month. Thank you all for listening, and look for this complete show on YouTube within another day or two. Thanks very much, and good night. Free your mind.